All right, today's new information video, we will do a review video as well, but this is the new information day. We're going to talk about settlement patterns. And I want to start with defining a settlement. We don't have a lot of new material left, but a little bit, some concepts to clean up a little bit over the next few weeks, and then a lot of review. But a settlement, what is a settlement? Well, you see the definition on the screen. A settlement is a permanent collection of buildings and inhabitants. So it's like, remember that before we had agriculture, the first agricultural revolution, people were nomadic herders and there were hunters and gatherers, and it was a stage one type of setting as people chased their food around. Birth rates were high, death rates were high. Remember what allowed people to settle down, settlement. In other words, they could live close together, be more clustered. And that was agriculture, the ability to grow stuff in one place. And agriculture has improved over time. And we talked about people like Esther Boserup and her basic assumption that the more kids, the more mouths we have to feed, then we're going to learn ways to produce more food in those settlement patterns. So that's what a settlement is. There are rural settlements and there are urban settlements. Urban, of course, means city. Rural means the country or not the city. And of course, in between, sort of, there's the suburban. Now, when it comes to settlements, the origins of settlements were usually based around several things. And what we're saying is, another great term, review here. When we look at a settlement, or we look back at a settlement, or we look from a remote sensing view from space of a settlement, we see what we call the cultural landscape. We see churches, we see graveyards, all that is part of the cultural landscape. There's some kind of belief or something that drove people to modify the land in the way it looks. Here's another great review, and I hadn't intended this to be near as much review, but it kind of works great this way. It also is an example of sequent occupants. Sequent occupants. Remember that sequent occupants is a cultural term that is shown when you're able to see through artifacts on the land and through buildings and design, whatever, any type of modified landscape, that different cultural groups have lived in a particular place and they've left footprints or fingerprints of their past culture. And so that's, Istanbul, Turkey is a great example. The Blue Mosque, which used to be a church. That's a great example of a cultural or a sequent of occupants and culture. But here's some of the things that impact settlements. Religion. Again, do we have graveyards? Is it like the Hindus? Do they cremate their dead? Is it churches, temples? Is it synagogues? Is it mosques? What do they look like? What are the symbols? Go back to your good time to review symbols. Sorry. On religious features and stuff like that. Schools and libraries, a lot of original towns in this country, in the United States, there would be a church, kind of like the node, functional region, that would be in the center of a town. And that church would often serve not just as the church, but it was the meeting hall. It was the town center. It was the school. So it became kind of the node of the functional region. Libraries, if there was a big, obviously, if education was very high prioritized in a society, whereas if it's not, then there may not be as much of an emphasis on libraries, maybe not as much on schools. How militarily, societies that were very militaristic, then if you're a military leader, that's going to be a very important, if you're going to live in probably a nice house. You're also, if you're worried about defending yourself, there's an enemy nearby, you may be a wall or walls, which your FRQ is actually about today. A lot of the old city-states had walls to defend themselves because they were constantly worried about invaders. And then economics. How do you live your life? So settlements look like things like we build our settlements in a way that revolves around how we live our lives. Morristown's a factory town. It's not a surprise then, especially in the time Morristown was growing, that there are railroad tracks in this town. Those railroad tracks provide a transportation device, and therefore it's for factories, it's a site and situational advantage, or may still be for some of them, to be near a railroad track. So our economics, if it's related to food, if it's related to water, we may build our landscape to suit what we need to survive. Remember the FRQ about the Netherlands and how one question asked you about the cultural landscape and how it affected their kind of the human landscape, the culture, how the physical affected the cultural. One thing you had there is there's so much water that a lot of the urban buildings, the urban settlements have to be built up instead of out because there's not a lot of land. And then there is such good farmland where they drained the water out of the polders areas that they're able to grow a lot of crops and they get a lot of wind. So they had the wind turbines there. So that's things you want to think about. Now, with types of settlements, again, there are rural and there are urban settlements. Rural and urban settlements. Rural settlements, as the predominant, agriculture is usually the predominant occupation, there. Not a surprise to any of you, I'm sure. Urban settlements, most people work in secondary factory jobs or tertiary. Tertiary jobs are service jobs. Now, I do think you need to know those terms. Primary sector of the economy is agriculture or lumberjacking. It's where you're working with nature. Secondary is where you take a raw material and you refine it. It's called like a factory. That's the greatest example. Tertiary is a service job, like most of the jobs we have here in the United States today, stage 4 and 5 countries, lawyers, doctors, teachers, researchers, all those kind of jobs, okay? Now, that's in the last 2 units, so they should not test that. But it is impressive and will help you, I think, if you can use that on the test. So that's kind of an extra caveat, I think, that could help you move your score up because you do know how to use primary jobs, deal straight with nature. Secondary takes the raw materials from nature and turns it into a finished product like factory jobs in Mexico or China or wherever or here. And tertiary jobs are more the service jobs, which are like the office jobs and anything serving the public, basically. Okay, so that's that. But here's the key for today. We want to look at the type of rural settlement patterns. This is where most of your notes will come in. Rural settlement patterns. There are 2 categories and 3 really kinds of rural settlement patterns to look at. There is clustered rural settlements. Let me scroll down just a minute. There is clustered rural settlement patterns, and there is dispersed rural settlement patterns. Now, they speak for themselves. Which one of these 3 is dispersed? Best example, dispersed, is the far left. These 2 are different versions of clustered. This is more of a nucleated clustered pattern, and this is more of a linear clustered pattern. Can you figure out, excuse me, can you figure out what might impact why these patterns exist? Why would this one, the settlements, the houses and buildings, be dispersed like this, while this one is nucleated clustered, and this one is more, like a long line where all the houses are close together, but then there's a lot of space out to the sides? Can you think of why? Maybe freeze this and think about that. Again, not looking up an answer, but what could cause that? For me, the one that would jump out in my thought process is I believe I might could figure this one out. Because that's a pretty strong pattern of distribution, right? Using our terms, use your terms. Strong pattern. There must be something situationally or relative location to this pattern, this line of people and houses. There must be. Could it be a waterway? Could it be a roadway? Could it be both? All right? Think about that. On the other hand, what could cause this? Is it a belief system? Would a religious group that wants to do their own thing back in the 1800s be more likely to settle like that on the right or like this? Think about it. Would the Puritans be more likely to live in this kind of a settlement or this kind of a settlement? I think most of you probably could figure out here. Because with this density and this clustering, they're better able to control all the influence was in that area. So let's take a look at what this was going to look like a little more specifically. And where you will find it, you need to know that. A nucleated, a more encircled clustered rural settlement, this one in the middle, these were very popular on America's East Coast, like the Puritans. From New York to Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, And every little town that you run into, people moved in, their cousins come in, the other cousins come in, friends came in, and they all settled and they nucleated around a church that was probably in the middle of the town, and everybody lived to the outside functional region. Early America. Now, if you've got this kind of a rural settlement, where's your farms at? Look, you can see them. They're the hinterlands. Notice something. This resembles Heinrich von Thunen a little bit. Even though he was talking commercial agriculture, this resembles von Thunen. Market, farmland. Where do you think you'll be milking cows and growing fruits and vegetables? Close to the settlements or further away? They're going to be in here. Trees, the timber area to the outside a little bit, and then grains and livestock ranching and so on. But this would be the American Northeast and many parts of Europe, really, originally. But then what about this linear clustered pattern, where they're clustered like in one direction? Notice these houses are on a bay. They're on the waterway. That is usually the case. Usually you can say linear patterns of clustered settlement. There is a river or a waterway that everybody wants access to, so they create narrow lots so that they can divide them and everybody gets access to the water or transportation device. Show you this. This is important to connect. Here's a nucleated pattern. A linear pattern will go along a line, and dispersed, of course, is just dispersed. Here is an example of the linear clustered pattern. It is very popular, was very popular in rural France. So it is very popular in what Canadian province? Quebec. What American states? The ones that border the Mississippi River, especially the ones the French settled, brought their culture with them. What they would do, everybody wanted, Mississippi River, any river, is going to produce some fertile land on its floodplains. Everybody wanted a piece of that. So typically speaking, if this was the river, they would set up their homes right along the river and then back from their homes. Now, in some cases, they set their homes on back a little bit. Most times, right along the river. And then in a long, thin lot, they would have this long extension of floodplain land. Everybody gets some good fertile land out of this that is along this area. It's thin, like you would have extremely long rows of a product. But this is what you still see. If you fly over Louisiana, you will see farms that look like this. Mississippi, you'll see farms that look like this. This is called the long, L-O-N-G, lot system. Because you may be asked questions about, I don't know, maybe, about survey systems. This is called the long lot system. It's this clustered rural settlement pattern versus the nucleated rural settlement pattern of the American Northeast. So in France and in parts of Louisiana, Quebec, you see the long lot, the linear one, because it's based on water, access to transportation. Now, as roads came along later, it altered this a little bit. Everybody typically had access to the road or to the water, and then their farmland was behind them, typically. All right. And then the third type of rural settlement pattern is the dispersed, this one. Flyover country, we call it in the United States. This is our Midwest. This is our Great Plains, our farming country, our grain country, our feed livestock ranching, or not, well, a little bit of ranching, but our mixed crop and livestock country. That's it. Okay, right here. Look at the squares. America's middle part of our country and our western part of our country was formed on something called, it was the Homestead Act that formed it. 160-acre plots of squared off land that was given to people who would farm it back in the 1800s. That was one of the pull for some immigrants. So this is a type of boundary that is a antecedent. Make sure you know the difference. Don't do like I did. Antecedent boundary is a boundary that's in place before the people get there. That's what this was. They didn't have any people hardly there, so the government drew up a boundary and then settled the people in it. Because it's antecedent, it was drawn up beforehand. Good review here. This has ended up being way more review than I thought. That's great, though. Because of that, it's also a what kind of boundary? It's a geometric boundary. Okay? Antecedent and geometric, so that our Midwestern states are very squared. Matter of fact, here is exactly how they drew them up. This is This is the diagram they used. So townships would be 6 miles squared. And then inside of every township, you had the individual neighborhoods, so to speak, or towns. And then this was the 640 acres within a 1 mile square. You would divide it up and give everybody their squares of land. So if you wonder why those farm houses are on squares out there, the farms are on squares out there in the Midwest, that's why. Here's some aerial footage. They might give you this. This may be one of your stimulus. They might show you this picture. What kind of rural settlement pattern is that? What factors led to this kind of a rural settlement pattern? How will this affect the people living there? Think about those kind of questions. And then here is a map about dominant land survey patterns in the United States. A couple things to talk about. Yellow says federal rectangular grid. That's the dispersed rural settlement squares we were talking about, right? The brown is the metes and bounds survey system. Metes and bounds comes from England, and what it is it was a subsequent type of boundary system. So people were already living there, and they needed a way to draw boundaries around their property. So they took physical features like boulders and mountains and ridges and rivers, and they used those in legal documents. That's why in East Tennessee, you might look up some old legal paperwork about your property line, and it might say something, you go to the big oak tree at such and such. And then you go from a straight line from the big oak tree to the fork in the river. That's a metes and bounds system, whereas this is more latitude, longitude for your geometric boundaries. Now, the blue is also more geometric and rectangular. The only difference there is land companies were granted those instead of the federal government. So that's a difference there. There's a few others on here. East Texas, the green, irregular rectangular divisions. There was just a little bit of these were divided by the government, but not in perfect squares. Basically is the big difference on those. And then these are townships up here in the orange, but they're not squared. And the purple is also irregular. A lot of wealthier people originally come in and settle that area. Maybe not as much anymore, but originally they did. But the ones you might be asked about more so, you got to know clustered rural, nucleated versus linear, and then the dispersed, and then the long lot and the metes and bounds system is what you may see questions about. Here's a picture of Quebec, developed along the St. Lawrence River. Everybody needed that waterway, and there was no survey system back then, so everybody's got a long, thin farm. And then they would divide the land amongst their own offspring, their kids, and it often ended up causing farms to get really, really small. This is a clustered rural settlement, a nucleated one, as a matter of fact. Not sure why that is. Hold on, if I move this out of the way here. Apparently not. Okay. It's actually hiding something. Resources are rural settlements, factors that affect them. What are the resources in the area? What is the transportation? That sounds a lot like Von Thunen, guys, if you think about it. And what are the government policies? You know, is the government dividing the land up in a certain way or trying to get people to live in a certain area? By the way, if you want to find these slides on OneNote, and I'm going to link another video that will help you with this, you can go to it's actually in the urban geography segment, but we're only using the first like 8 or 9 slides because the other stuff we don't need. And it's called Settlement Patterns under Urban Geography. You can look this up. But hopefully you have some questions on that. I don't know how detailed they're going to get on this on the test because it's kind of a crossover between Unit 7 and 5. Unit 5's on the test, Unit 7's not. But we got to know it a little bit because it could be there. And it's all about geography, and it's great to review with. That's what I love about it. So, again, look over this. Let me know if you have questions.